Good morning, and welcome to our very first CMA Studio summer session. My name is Joyce Beyer, and I'm really excited to be here. Sounds like we have a little bit of an echo, but that is okay. We'll get it all figured out. First time, lots of things to learn, but I'm excited that you're here. So we're going to get started with our lesson, but while that's going on, if you have any questions, feel free to set them in the chat section, in the comments section of the video. I'll do my best to take a look at it while the video is going on and answer any questions you have. If I don't know, I'll help you look it up and we can learn it together. Once the lesson gets done, be sure to stick around because I have some information on a fun game we have planned for you. And those of you who show us that you have completed it, you're going to be entered to win some family tickets. So I'm really excited. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start off today by talking about our goals, what we're going to learn. Today we have two goals. The first one, by the end of today, I want you to be able to say, I can identify the instruments in the string quartet. Second thing, by the end of today, I want you to be able to say, I can compare and contrast the composers Bach and Mozart. Now, some of you may already know some of these things. Some of you may not know anything yet. That's okay, wherever you are. My goal is that you learn a little bit of new information and it helps you when you're listening to the music tomorrow. So we're going to start off by talking about the string family. Now, there are a lot of instruments that have strings on them. Some of the most popular ones, things like guitars, harps have strings, but really what I'm going to focus on are instruments that are played with the bow. I have several of those here. This is a bow. And this is what makes our version of string instruments a little bit different from like a guitar or something like that. Essentially how these instruments work is they are a hollow box of wood with some holes and strings that go above them. And then we make those strings vibrate either by plucking them or by using this bow. And that's how we create sound. Our instruments are a little bit interesting. We, in addition to being made out of wood, they actually use different animal products in them too. The first that we still use today is horsehair. So this bow, part of what we're using is actual hair. If I make it really loose, I can wiggle that hair around, just like I can wiggle my own hair around. Don't worry, they don't actually harm any horses. They just get them a haircut. Another thing that people used to do way back in the day, we have these strings here, and these strings now are not made this way. A long time ago, they actually were called catgut strings. Don't worry, not made out of cats. They were, however, made out of sheep's intestines, which is a little bit gross, but kind of interesting to know about our instruments. So you see one in my hands here. We're going to start off with the smallest instrument in this bowed string family, and that is the violin. Now, when I think of the violin, some of my first interactions with the instrument were actually things that were more like fiddle music or like a hoedown. But I think that the violin is one of the most versatile instruments in the world. In addition to playing things like fiddle music, it can also play classical music. And that's what you're going to hear a lot of this summer is classical music on our string instruments. Now, I already told you this is the smallest instrument, and because it's the smallest one, it has the highest pitch sounds of all of the instruments in this bowed string family. And if we were to think about it in terms of what the different roles of the strings are, and we think about it kind of like we would a choir, the violin is the instrument that takes over that soprano role, the person who sings the melody line. When you're listening to a song and you hear like that main melody, a lot of times that's being played by the violin. The next instrument we're going to talk about, though, is my personal favorite. It looks a lot like the violin, but it's a little bit different. you notice already off of that, a little bit bigger. This is called the viola. Like I said, my personal favorite. I think it has a beautiful mellow sound. Played basically exactly the same way as the violin, but because it has that mellow sound, it kind of has a different role in our string quartet. Now, I told you the violin was like our melody instrument, our soprano. The viola could be thought of as an alto, but it actually plays more of a tenor role, so even lower pitched in sound because we have these four voices. Because it's a little bit bigger, a little bit lower sound, but the next instrument I'm going to show you is actually the lowest of all of them and the biggest of all of them. This is the cello. So the other ones I was able to put up on my shoulder. This would be very hard to play that way. I don't think my arm could reach. I'm sure people have tried it, and I'm sure you could find a video on the internet where someone is doing that. This will not be that video. So in order to play it, I sit down, which is a nice little break. I use this thing called an end pin. Pop it out, and it sits right here between my legs, leaning against my body. If I were to go back and change everything about my life, I feel like I would want to play the cello. It's such a beautiful, like deep, rich sound. And in our string quartet, it's the sound that is going to provide the bass. I'll play a little bit for you. By no means the world's greatest cello player, but I really like playing it because I can feel the vibrations. I can feel the sound happening while I'm playing. And like I said, that really nice big bass sound. Perfect coming from the cello. If this were a part of the Baby Shark family, this would definitely be like Daddy Shark level. Whereas our smaller instruments would be the smaller sharks in that family. So I just showed you the three instruments in a string quartet. I know those of you who are smart are thinking to yourselves, wait a minute, quartet? That means four. How come we only saw three instruments? Well, in a traditional string quartet, we actually have two violins, a viola and a cello. So violin one takes over that soprano role, violin two, alto, viola, tenor, and cello is the bass. I don't know why people chose to do exactly that sort of thing. I think it goes back to how chamber music and the string quartets started. So back in the day, chamber music, which string quartets are a part of, it was literally music that someone played in their chamber, in their home. They did it with friends. The friends would just come over, they'd have a good time. Kind of like maybe you would invite friends over to play a video game or a game in general, or watch a movie. People would come over to play music or watch music together. They didn't have TVs back then, so they had to do something a little bit different. And so probably what happened is those were the instruments that the people at the party had. Those were the instruments that the person who composed the music had available to them. And so they created beautiful music together in that way. So we talked a little bit about the instruments in the string quartet. That was goal number one. Hopefully you can now correctly identify those instruments. If someone were to ask you, hey, what's in a string quartet? Anyway, you're like, I know, it's the violin, the viola, and the cello. Oh, wait, there's two violins. So now we're gonna stretch it up, go on to goal number two. I like to move around a lot, so if you're sitting down, feel free. Wiggle, make sure you're staying awake. Next thing we're gonna talk about are the composers that you're gonna hear the Belin Quartet play music from tomorrow. Before we talk about those composers, which are Bach and Mozart, I wanna just review. Some of you may already know this, but just to review, a composer is a person who composes or writes, creates music. We have had composers throughout all of history. We have composers that are alive today. It's not just one type of music. It's literally a person who creates music. So the first person we're going to talk about is probably one of the most famous composers in the history of the world. Most people have heard of this person. If you haven't yet, cool. I'm excited to tell you a little bit about him. His name is Johann Sebastian Bach. Big, long name. We normally refer to him as Bach. I know it looks like batch. Bach. He was born in 1685. He died in 1750. And he spent most of his life in Germany. Now, here's an interactive thing for you. If you know what continent Germany is in, I want you to put it in the chat section of this video and let me know that you know what it is. We'll go through a little bit later and you can check yourself. Bach is really well known for being a composer during the Baroque era. And we tend to label different eras of music throughout history because it helps tell us a little bit about them. I partially point out what era he was a part of because he was so important that when he died, that era stopped. That's how important he was. He died in 1750. That's the end of the Baroque era. And when people think of Baroque music, Bach is one of those really, really big names. When he was a composer, he didn't just write music. He also had a job, well, probably multiple jobs at multiple churches, being an organist. I have a picture here that you can take a look at that has a pipe organ and a piano. Notice the pipe organ is on the back. It's way bigger. And it's different from what we see in a piano. It does have a keyboard that people play with their fingers. It also has pedals that they play with their feet. And then it creates sound by blowing air through those big pipes that you see. We have pipe organs actually all over in Des Moines. Some of you may actually have seen one before if you've gone to one of the bigger churches here or even gone to Drake University. There are a lot of pipe organs even here today, but Bach was very well known for playing them. A little bit more about Bach. He came from a really big family of composers. He is the most famous one from his family by far. But he had a lot of relatives and children who also composed music. And so if you hear someone talking about Bach, you might want to double check which one they're talking about. We refer to this Bach, Johann Sebastian, as J.S. Bach, but there's also a J.C. Bach, a C.P.E. Bach. There are a lot of different ones. And they all wrote slightly different, but they're all related to Bach, which is pretty cool. Along that line, he had 20 children. Seriously, that's a lot of kids. Anyone out there have 20 kids in their family? I do not. I think that's just kind of an interesting fact about him, and I like to share those things because I think that makes people that we wouldn't know otherwise a little bit more interesting too. Another thing about him is he composed over 1,100 different pieces of music. That's a ton. And he wrote for all different things. So we talked about the pipe organ. He wrote things for organ and for different keyboard instruments. He wrote things for the instruments you see here, although the instruments were a little bit different back then. He wrote things for choir. He was a very well-rounded composer. And that's part of, I think, why he's still so famous today is he was one of the biggest ones from that time, and he just created a lot of different music. So we talked about, it's time to go on to our second composer that you're going to hear tomorrow, and that is Mozart, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, to give you his full official name. You'll notice he lived a slightly different time from Bach. So he was actually born after Bach died, but not very long after. He was born in 1756, and he died in 1791. So he also didn't live as long as Bach. He died in his 30s. Now, you'll see he was born in Austria. Now, I have a photo up here that shows you Austria is actually right next to where Germany is. And both of those countries are located in Europe. So if you guessed Europe earlier, you were absolutely right. Mozart is also known for being a composer in the classical era of music. So Bach was considered Baroque. Mozart is classical. And I think he is one of the biggest probably names that we would think of when we think of classical music. The way that he writes is exactly what we would hear. We have the violin that is playing like these beautiful melodies, and the rest of the string quartet is more of a supporting role the majority of the time. Another kind of interesting thing about Mozart he was a prodigy. And prodigy means that from a very young age, he was very good at music. Today, we can go on YouTube and we can find all sorts of little videos of tiny little children playing things very well. That's kind of what Mozart was. He started learning the piano like age 3 to 4, and by the time he was 5 or 6, he was already composing big pieces of music. He also played other instruments like the violin. A little bit more about Mozart. I don't know if any of you have ever heard the song Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, or maybe the ABC song. Mozart is actually the person that people say wrote the melody for that. If you are a person who takes a string instrument, maybe in your school program, we use this book called Essential Elements, and there's a song in there called a Mozart melody. And it's always funny because people start playing it and they're like, wait, I know this. This isn't something new. But that piece was actually written by Mozart. He wrote a lot of music, just like Bach, not quite as much, probably because he didn't live as long. So he wrote about 600 pieces, but 26 of those were string quartets, like the one that you're going to hear. When he died a little bit mysteriously. People aren't 100% sure why he died. And he died before he finished one of his last pieces of music, which is a beautiful requiem for a big like choir plus orchestra. So people have finished that for him, but I think it's kind of interesting to note that he has this kind of mysterious death that happened. So we talked about our two composers, how they were a little bit similar. They both like grew up in Europe. They both composed, but they were a little bit different too. So let's go ahead and talk about the two pieces that you're going to hear. So the first thing you're going to hear is a Gigue by Bach from an orchestral suite. That's a lot of words. It's kind of a funny looking word, but it actually is pronounced Gigue, and it is very similar to like a jig. So I talked about how the violin used to play things like fiddle music too. This Gigue is kind of a variation on what we would consider like a dance. It was a dance at that time, just like a jig is a dance. So what you're going to hear is the group is going to play like nice and fast. It's very lively. And this is a dance that maybe at one of those chamber music parties that people had, people would have shown up and they all would have known the steps to a Gigue. They would have known what the rhythms were and how it would go, kind of like we do line dances, or I don't know if you watch TikTok, there are a bunch of TikTok dances that like everybody knows all of the motions for. I obviously am not one of those people, but dances back in the day, that was what they were like. So this piece, the Gigue, is from a larger set of pieces that were originally for an orchestra. So they're going to be played by the quartet, but it's more of an arrangement, made a little bit smaller for that ensemble. Very fun though. I think you're going to like it a lot. The second piece is a little bit different because it's a little bit bigger. So it's a full string quartet. I know we talked about what a string quartet involves instruments, but when we talk about a piece that's created for those instruments, it's also called a string quartet. So this is a string quartet that's one of Mozart's most famous. It's called the Dissonance String Quartet. And it also has a number that has a K next to it. So K, 4, 6, 5. We number Mozart's music with these K numbers. So if you see a higher number next to the K, that means he wrote it later in life, closer to when he died. Lower numbers are when he was younger. And then, so this has 4 movements. I have them listed up here. These movements, their titles have to do with how fast or slow they are. So the first one is an adagio dash allegro. So it starts off very slow, and it's going to go to fast. Our second movement is andante cantabile, which cantabile means like beautiful singing. So you're here again, first violin, do a beautiful singing melody. It's very beautiful. You might think it's a little bit slow. I think it's gorgeous, and I want you to close your eyes and kind of imagine the things that it'll make you think about. Movement 3 is a minuetto, which just like Gigue is a form of a dance. Minuet traditionally is kind of like a waltz. So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Again, I'm not a great dancer. I do not claim to be, but I think it's cool to know these things about the piece of music. The last movement is allegro, which literally means very fast. So he likes to end with a big flash, big flourish, lots of fun things. So we talked about the composers, we talked about their music. You've got a lot of information. So stretch it out. We're going to review what our goals were today and see if we hit them. So today's goals. By then today, I want you to be able to say, I can identify the instruments in a string quartet. Well, we talked about it. We have violin, the viola, and the cello. Remember, there's 2 violins in a string quartet, and they're all a little bit different based on how big they are and the type of sound they create, whether it's a higher sound or a lower rich sound. Goal number 2, I can compare and contrast composers Bach and Mozart. Now, did we learn everything about these composers today? No. But hopefully you at least learned a little bit where you could say, hey, I've heard of Bach before. Hey, I've heard of Mozart. And a little bit about what their lives were like and what made them similar or maybe a little bit different. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you next week. Welcome back. I hope that you were able to learn something, maybe a little bit different, something that you didn't know before. But as I promised, we actually have something else that you can do on your own too. So we have prepared for you a game of Kahoot. I know some of you have probably played this before. Basically, it's like a fun trivia game. So what you're going to do, the directions are on our website. If you go to civicmusic.org, click on education, you'll be able to get a link with the directions to do this, but I'll explain it now too. So you're going to go to kahoot.it, Kahoot.it, and then you'll insert our code to play the game, our game pin, which we can put in the chat section of this, but is also on our website. And you can go through and test your knowledge on some of the things that we talked about today. If you complete this activity, what we want you to do is show us that you did it. So you can send us a selfie with your high score to info@civicmusic.org, and you're going to be entered to win a family pack of tickets to one of our great concerts this season. So thanks so much for joining us today. I hope to see you next week, and I hope that you tune in tomorrow for the Belin Quartet concert at 6 p.m.